You are listening to the Conscious Life Podcast, the official podcast of ConsciousLifeNews.com, where you can find the latest in the world of alternative news, hidden truths, health, and spirituality. I'm your host, Jonathan Wilbanks, and joining us again is the UFO historian, Richard Dolan. This is the second part of a three-part Conscious Life podcast series with Richard Dolan. Tonight, we'll be discussing the national security state, one of Richard's many areas of expertise. And don't forget to join us again next week as we wrap up the series with a discussion about spirituality and consciousness and their complex relationship to the UFO phenomenon. Thank you for joining us again, Richard.
Oh, hi, Jonathan. I'm very happy to be here.
Without getting too much into doom and gloom, it seems pretty clear to all informed parties at this point that our national security state is really spiraling out of control. What are some recent developments in this area that we should be aware of?
Well, it sure is. That's a definite area of concern, or at least should be of concern to every person who cares about individual freedom and privacy. Really, we've been on a path that has been going in a certain direction since at least the end of the Second World War, but it's really picked up steam since 9/11, certainly September 11, 2001, when we started seeing the enactment of very, very heavy-handed, overt measures that, they're kind of in your face, saying that the government has the right to do things like sneak and peek, that is, sneak into your house, look around, without a traditional court warrant for many of these types of activities. The government has, legalized what it had been doing all along, which is reading your emails. During the 1990s, the government wasn't supposed to be reading your emails, although we absolutely know for sure that they have been collecting your emails and everyone else's emails. But now they have it's now out in the open as a legal authority. So that there really is effectively no privacy. And certain events in our culture have only aided the government's efforts, things like Facebook, which is universal. I mean, heck, if I were a CIA officer or an NSA officer and I wanted to monitor a person, probably the first place I would go would be their Facebook page. But, of course, there's email snooping and all these, so many other measures now that are in place. There's drone surveillance increasingly becoming big. So we're at a point now where things have just spiraled out of control. Cities throughout, municipalities throughout the U.S. and other nations have instituted like cameras. Many cities have cameras at street corners where drivers can easily be identified through facial recognition software. So that really there are fewer and fewer metropolitan places that a person can have any kind of privacy whatsoever.
And you mentioned Facebook, and WikiLeaks' Julian Assange basically said at one point that Facebook was the CIA's biggest spying operation of all time. But one of the interesting things about Facebook, I think, as opposed to other sorts of internet-based surveillance, is that I don't think it's subject to the same privacy laws that, at least in theory, our emails and phone communication should be, because we're putting all of this information out there voluntarily. They don't have to. The government doesn't have to pry into our lives illegally. We're giving the information out there for free. Seems like that makes their job pretty easy?
Yes, absolutely. And Facebook is one of the most addictive phenomena of the last 5 years. I mean, anyone who's got a Facebook page pretty much knows this. So that, we're all putting out information out there. Of course, now, often it's not sensitive information. But if the government were wanting to monitor a public figure, for example, their Facebook page would certainly be one way to do it. We have confirmation from various government agencies that, in fact, they, absolutely use things like Facebook and Twitter now in order to gauge their own policies and gauge reaction. I mean, they've got now software applications out there that are heuristic, that are, have a lot of intelligence, and it's useful for them. They say openly in gauging public reaction to various government statements that are made and so forth. So they're obviously interested. They'd be fools not to be interested in something like Facebook or Twitter.
What steps? I mean, obviously, I love Facebook. I think it's a great way to stay in touch. I think it's a great way to share important information. But is it prudent for us to be a little bit paranoid in terms of what we put out there? Is it better to just say, there's nothing I can do about it, so I'm just going to speak my truth as loudly as possible and not worry? Is there a middle ground there in terms of how we can moderate our public online activity to provide an optimal balance between freedom of speech and the protection of our own privacy?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I like you, I have an active Facebook life as well, and for me, I've known for sure for more than a decade that I've been monitored in various ways. I've had this confirmed to me via emails from individuals saying they're insiders. They certainly knew an awful lot about me, things that were not available from my public information, for sure. So I know I've been monitored. I used to get hassled at airports for years. My name was flagged. So I've gone through all of that. I'm at the point in my life personally where I know there is no escape for me. Whatever I do, I assume they, NSA, and their allies have ways of monitoring all of my stuff. So for me on Facebook, although I do still, out of habit, avoid discussing matters that are particularly sensitive regarding my research, mostly everything else is out there. I do a tremendous amount of email correspondence via Facebook. I make public statements on Facebook frequently. As far as what other people have to make in their personal decisions, I mean, that comes down to each person's choice, of course, but you have to be aware. One of my favorite expressions to live by is, it's the nail that sticks out that gets hammered. So in other words, the government is really not going to care about you if you, like all of your neighbors, basically go through your life keeping your head down and not making waves. You can get as goofy as you want in your personal life. They probably won't care. If you begin to speak up, if you begin to speak your truth and get your head above the rest of the crowd, you will be monitored. That doesn't mean that they're going to come out and come after you with piano wire or even try to destroy you professionally. But it does mean that they'll monitor you. There's very little way to get around it. And so what the most important quality, quite honestly, is just courage. Those people who believe certain things that they hold strongly, it's very important for us today not to allow ourselves to be intimidated by government spying, because it is everywhere. There is no way around it. For us, for those of us seeking positive change in this world today, courage is the number one quality. You got to have it. And there are people who are, I mean, I've seen it every week. I'll talk to people who they're new to the alternative media, and not everyone handles things very well. That's the truth. I have relatives. You've got relatives. I'm sure you could think of a few people like this. I certainly know many people. Everyone is different. There are some people who are they're not going to be heroes. They're not going to be warriors. They want to live their life. They want to watch their American Idol, their football games. They want their life. They don't want it to be too complicated. They just want to do their thing. For those people, they have nothing to worry about in terms of government surveillance. Government doesn't care about them. And that's a lot of people. But people who've got a little more ambition in their careers, a little more courage and inquisitiveness about their world, you're going to have to be prepared that if you are effective enough at what you do, you're going to get someone's attention.
With the whole American Idol and Dancing with the Stars crowd, with the people that really just don't want to engage in this, one of the responses that one frequently hears from them is, oh, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, then there's nothing to worry about. Why do you care if you're being monitored if you have nothing to hide? And that seems pretty messed up to me, but I don't quite understand where the disconnect is there with some people.
Well, it could have been said during Hitler's Third Reich. It could have been said during Stalin's Russia. Hey, if you're not doing anything wrong, why are you complaining about anything? The point is that in a free society, the thing about freedom is that freedom isn't worth jack if I only have the freedom to do things that you approve of, or that a government narrowly approves of. Freedom is only worth something when I'm allowed to express myself, even in ways that you don't like, as long as it is not violent, as long as I'm not doing physical harm or damaging you in some way. But I should be allowed to express my opinions on matters. And when people who are expressing solely their dissent are under surveillance for that reason, and often worse, often they are subjected to different types of persecution and attack. When we have that type of a situation, we are moving to a greater or lesser extent toward the type of totalitarian states that, once upon a time America used to fight against.
Well, unfortunately, on that note, writing for Wired magazine, James Bamford recently said that we are this close, and you can't see me, but my fingers are about an inch apart, from a turnkey totalitarian state in the U.S. In your assessment, is this accurate? And can you talk a little bit about the substance of that article, which was the NSA's new $2 billion spying center in Utah?
Yeah, I read that article as well. It's a very important piece. I believe Bamford was quoting some other analyst, if I'm not mistaken. The phrase that's correct, and I think it's a very vivid and apropos statement. And really, what he means, a turnkey totalitarian state, essentially a state in which you are effectively monitored in ways that Hitler could only have dreamed of, that Stalin could only have dreamed of, or Mao Zedong. There's the capability now. The NSA has created, the National Security Agency, let us just say, has created a $2 billion complex in Utah, middle of nowhere, where all, and I mean all, electronic data is being collected and stored and presumably analyzed. That means every email that I've ever written, that I've ever done. I've been doing email for almost about 20 years now, I guess. And hell, I don't have access to most of my emails from the 1990s, but guess what? I'm sure the NSA does. So maybe one day I'll take a trip down to Utah and ask them for my backup of my 1990s emails, right? Good luck for me getting it. But that's the point. Like, they literally have that. And the legality of this is being challenged. Clearly, not everyone is willing to take this without a challenge, but the fact is that they've done it. It's a fait accompli. There's really no movement at the federal level to stop this. I mean, not at all. It's the opposite direction. They're pushing it forward. So when a government agency has the ability, literally, to know every single electronic communication you've ever made. And in our age today, that's how everyone communicates. Writes letters the old-fashioned way.
Well, and
Everyone
even if you're talking
email.
on the phone, it's all getting converted into binary information. I mean, it's all being digitized anyway. So literally, all of our communication.
The phone is another one. And
unless you're talking with Campbell's soup
Bamford,
cans and string.
James Bamford, who you refer to, wrote a book about 10 years ago called Body of Secrets. And that's still a great book. And essentially it's a study of the NSA. And at that time, Bamford wrote about the program known as Echelon, which, even to this day, I don't think has been openly acknowledged by the U.S. government, but everyone knows that it exists. And really what Echelon is, or I don't even know if it goes by that name anymore, but it's a global electronic sweep with the U.S. NSA and the NSA equivalents of a number of other nations. 10 years ago, they were all English-speaking nations like Canada, Britain, New Zealand, Australia. I'm sure Echelon includes other nations now, but I don't know. But the point is that they did electronic data sweeps even then of essentially the entire globe. And that included even then cell phone calls and landline calls, so all telephone, faxes, which people don't fax that much anymore, but anything that was sent electronically. And one thing Bamford described, and this is he wrote this book in 2001, 2002, he described the use of geosynchronous satellites. And really all that they did is they would be assigned a particular region, and they would scoop up electronic signals in that area. And then all of that data would be sent to an NSA collection center, and you would have personnel go to their desk the next morning, and essentially after all of these various filters have been applied, they would have X number of really important communications to run through an analysis. And so that's really all it was. The big issue that he described at that time was not the collection. That actually had been pretty much solved. The problem was filtering. So how to get from 100,000 or maybe 500,000 messages in a region down to the true handful that would actually be important that you really need to act on. And I don't know how perfect that system was at the time, or even indeed today. But these are the things that are very, very important to them. They want algorithms that are able to be effective filters. They want programs that are going to be able to do voice recognition better and better under all different types of conditions. So this is what it's all about. It's email, voice, it's everything. Everything. They want to monitor us through every way. And what will they do with that information? Well, I assume they'll only do something with it when you or I or anyone else sticks out enough that action must be taken in one way or another.
Well, there's some interesting implications in what you're saying about the incredibly advanced state of NSA technology. You're talking about voice recognition that apparently, presumably 10, 20 years ago, even if it was in somewhat infant stages, was still working. Siri on my iPhone can barely understand me half the time, and that's developed by one of the largest companies on the planet. So how far ahead of present-day technology do you think that the NSA is? At one point, I think you've relayed an anecdote about the NSA having like a 600 megahertz processor back in the 1960s, and that's
right.
That fact really just blew my mind, because we didn't reach those speeds in regular commercial computers until the late 1990s.
Correct. Yeah, that scientist that I spoke to was at NSA circa 1965 and told me that they had processors there running at 650 megahertz clock speed, which roughly we didn't get in the consumer market till 1999 or 2000, around that time. So, today, of course, everyone's got faster than that. But that's a 35-year gap. That's quite significant. And in 1965, needless to say, there were no personal computers anywhere. And in 1965, I'll just add, the NSA had only been outed that year, or like the year before. So if you were to go back to 1964, presumably they still had probably the best computers in the world at that time. And at that time, no one in the world even knew they existed. It's really an incredible thing. So yeah, they've been ahead of us in computing, obviously, for a long time. Now, there very well could be other also clandestine government or intelligence groups that also have very advanced technology. It doesn't have to only be the NSA. But we're talking 3.5 decades, almost 2 full generations of human life that they were ahead by. So in terms of what they've got today, right, you mentioned Siri. I actually am very fond of Siri. Mine works pretty well on my iPhone, but I've learned how to work with it. You got to go slow with Siri. You've got to be very clear. And that's the point. It's not perfect. And the question is, how perfect what they have? Well, it comes down to two things. It comes down to software, and it comes down to processing power, it seems to me. Certainly, they've got awesome processing power. So I have to assume that they're much more capable in that regard as far as voice recognition. And I'm going to take a wild guess and assume that they have better software. We know this happens all the time where, take such a simple example as like Google Earth. What you and I see on Google Earth is a a very low-res version of what NSA has had access to for years. And there are still big blank spots if you want to find different places on Google Earth. So we have public versions of what within the classified world is much more advanced. I've got to think their VR is way, way better than anything that we have on the market right now.
I was recently reading a book by Stansfield Turner, who was President Carter's director of Central Intelligence, and it was called Secrecy and Democracy, the CIA in Transition, I believe. And he was talking about, during his tenure at the CIA, during the Carter administration, he said that they had spy satellites that, and this was just what he was able to publicly acknowledge, he said that they had spy satellites that could read license plates from space, and that within 5 to 10 years they would be able to read the newsprint on a newspaper from over somebody's shoulder from orbit. And that was in the 1970s, so I can't imagine where that technology must be today. And then also that 650 megahertz figure from 1965, I don't know if the NSA's internal technology development has adhered to Moore's Law. But if it has, then that 30-year head start on the rest of the commercial world translates into just an astronomical processing gap. I mean, I'm kind of a tech nerd, and I can't even wrap my brain around how fast that computer would have to be.
Yeah, there's so much to say regarding all of this. Regarding the license plate reading ability, I haven't read that Stansfield Turner book. I bet it's great. But that capability existed actually in the early to mid-'60s. So the optics on at least U.S. high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, maybe I'm thinking of the U-2 spy plane, but it also had an equal type of capability to what Stansfield Turner is writing about. So the capability has been extreme for quite some time. Now, what was the other thing? We were just going to get into something interesting here. And, oh, gosh. This is what happens. Is this a pre-senior moment? I don't know.
Moore's Law.
What was the other thing you had mentioned? Because I wanted to follow up on it.
Moore's Law and the NSA?
Oh, well, yeah. One thing that I wonder about the NSA is to what extent have they made any inroads into quantum computing? That's something that's very, very interesting, and I think that there is probably going to be a future in quantum computing, and essentially all that means is it's brace yourselves if you don't know what this is. It's essentially using atoms, actually not even atoms, using, I guess, well, maybe atoms, maybe electrons, to get you your ones and zeros. And it has to do with concepts known as quantum entanglement. So you entangle atoms and tiny particles, and as long as they're entangled, that means one atom or one electron is connected invisibly somehow to its twin. And so when you get a positive spin on one, you get a negative spin on the other, and somehow, don't ask me how, because I still don't understand this, that can translate into ones and zeros, basic binary code. And the thing about quantum computing is that its capabilities, to call it vast is an incredible understatement. So quantum computing will be to our current computing what our current computing is to, say, the Gutenberg printing press. In other words, whenever there's a quantum computer, it would exceed the computational ability of all computers on planet Earth right now. And the question is, can it be done? And that's really the question, and everyone argues about it. But I really wonder, like, if the NSA, because Moore's Law is believed to be approaching its limit at some point. You're going to have to reach a limit with Moore's Law as long as you're dealing with silicon technology. The only way to get around it is by using different materials.
Well, Intel just made a huge leap forward. Intel just made a huge leap forward by doing 3D transistors, which I thought was a really innovative step. But I think they're going to be able to extend that out for another 5 to 10 years based on that technology, which will be really interesting.
Well, that's fascinating. fascinating. See, I love talking to anyone who knows a lot more about this than me, which are many people. I'm a real novice when it comes to a lot of this tech, and all I try to do is to keep my head above the water so that I can get a grasp of what's happening. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly going to be ways of delaying or pushing back Moore's Law. And really, what we're asking is to what extent the NSA has been able to move ahead of the rest of us. And I don't know the answer to that. They were decades ahead of us back during the 60s. I think we'd be fools to think that they're not ahead of us in critically important ways right now, in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of nanotech, in terms of just computing in general. I think that they're going to be well ahead of us. Biotech is another area where I'd be interested in, not necessarily NSA, but other black agencies where they're at.
Oh, that could get scary.
Yeah. Regarding the whole growth of a national security state, incidentally, I would just point out that the NSA was a secret agency for its first 12 years, basically, from 1952 up until 1964-65. It literally was not an acknowledged government agency, and then it became outed. The same was the case with the even more secret NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, which was founded in 1960. It was a felony to mention the existence of the NRO, even for a member of Congress, right up until about 1990, when the NRO became public knowledge. So for 30 years, the NRO was secret, and that's important because the NRO's job officially is to monitor all spy satellites, basically America's eyes and ears in space. And when you're thinking about UFOs, well, certainly there's a lot of space-based UFO data that researchers have been acquainted with. So presumably the NRO's hip deep in all of that. So in other words, the United States has its own substantial history of very significant federal agencies that existed black, that existed deeply secret, in other words. And when I look at something like UFO phenomenon, knowing, as I do, that there are certain very important things about that phenomenon that government agencies need to keep secret, I think the most logical assumption is that there are probably other equally dark secret agencies that do exist, but they don't officially exist, and that are here to monitor the UFO phenomenon. In fact, I did receive this exact piece of information from a friend/colleague of mine who lives in the Washington, D.C. area. He's a very high-level government employee. He's got a high security clearance. And just relayed to me a conversation he had with a congressional aide. Keep in mind, a lot of congressional aides are, they're not just kids. They're very experienced, mature men and women in their 50s and 60s have been around the block and know a few things. This congressional aide told my friend that there was indeed a very large black arm of government, that was the word used, that is that's connected with the UFO phenomenon. So in other words, a large executive arm of government that is secret, that deals with the UFO phenomenon.
Now, when you say executive, do you mean related to the presidential branch, or what do you mean?
Yes,
by executive?
I believe that's the. Well, they did use the person, and I didn't get this directly, of course, but the person used the word executive. So I don't know if that means president. I mean, that's how we typically think of it, but executive in the sense that it is empowered to act. You know, unlike, say, Congress or the Supreme Court. So this is an arm. It is an executive agency.
That's empowered to act unilaterally without oversight.
Yeah. Whether the president has anything to do with it, I don't know. I've had reason to believe that the president may not have a whole lot to do directly with this phenomenon. I mean, after all, think about it. If you're the president, you've got to kiss the babies, you've got to shake the hands, you've got to meet with the dignitaries, you've got to campaign, get reelected. It's very difficult for any president to have enough time just logistically to deal with all of the clandestine activities that go on within the United States under the rubric of the United States government. It is literally impossible, I think. And so, and something as explosive as the UFO phenomenon, it might just be safer to keep that away from the president. And the president might agree to that for all we know. He might say, you know what? You do what you got to do here. Keep it the hell away from me because I don't want to get my hands dirty with that one. It's quite possible. That's actually what I was told on one occasion. And you know, whatever my sources are, I mean, are they truthful or are they not? Hard for me to say. I will tell you, I had a conversation with a very high-level retired man with CIA who did tell me that some presidents have known more than others, and a lot of presidents are not briefed fully because presidents come and go, but the people running the program, they're lifers. And not all presidents, he said, are particularly reliable in the opinion of the people running the program. So not every president is equally apprised or has been equally apprised historically. The gentleman who told me that is actually a very famous individual. One day, I'd like to be able to release his name, so we'll see.
So we're talking about a group then that can act unilaterally, has no accountability, and is either on par with or supersedes the real power of the public executive branch.
Yeah, I'd say that's putting it pretty well. I'd say that's about right.
Wow. Well, let's switch gears a little bit here. I'd be interested to get your take on this whole drone phenomenon. There's a few aspects of this that are really interesting. You know, one is just, you know, the huge mobilization of the Department of Homeland Security, of the U.S. military abroad, and also what DHS is doing here domestically to start rolling out spy drones. But, you know, what we see on TV is, you know, on the news reports are these big plane-like drones, but there's also much smaller ones that are starting to be deployed. You know, as small as there was a report last week that one as small as a mosquito had been developed, which is kind of scary. And then also some of the new designs that we're seeing are looking more and more like UFOs. And I found all this very interesting and would love to get your take on it.
Oh, it's absolutely critically important for people involved in UFO research to be on top of what's happening in drone technology. This is a really important development. You know, 20 years ago, we didn't have to worry about these things. Now, I mean, a lot of the drones, the better-known drones, like the Predator, which has done a lot of work in Afghanistan, they look pretty much like airplanes. You're not going to mistake them for UFOs. And a lot of the drones look like really cool airplanes. One of the drones looks very much like kind of like a combination of the stealth fighter and stealth bomber. It's very angular. It's kind of like a flying wing design. But now, most of the time, you're not going to mistake those types of drones for UFOs. And these are military drones that typically are involved in attack or multiple roles, attack and reconnaissance and things like this. And they're fairly large enough. They're essentially airplane-size objects. And those are the types of drones that get the most press. But as you say, you're exactly right. There's a wider range of drones. There are helicopter-like drones. In other words, drones that essentially have a variety of propellers that allow them to, and they're very stable. They're very, very stable. And they come in all different types of sizes nowadays. And I also saw an image of that one, which was like the size of a large bug, essentially. It could easily fit on a person's hand. So they're getting smaller and smaller. It's very easy to make them look like classic UFOs, by the way. You get they just have essentially propellers is what they have to keep them up. They're standard aerodynamics. They're not doing field propulsion or anti-gravity or anything like that. But then you just create a kind of UFO body around them. It doesn't really impede any of the aerodynamics, and you can make them look like UFOs. You can make them move to some extent like UFOs without the speeds so far. The drones that at least that I'm aware of don't have performance capabilities anything like what you get with UFOs. So there's that difference.
When I say UFO-like, I'm thinking more of the militarized ones that are being used overseas. There was one. This was on the Drudge Report a couple weeks ago. There was one. A guy had called into 911, panicked because he saw what he thought was a UFO being carried on the back of a truck, and it turned out to be one of these drones. And they're very kind of in between.
Yeah.
Some of them look like this in between of a triangular and a flying saucer shape, and they've got these big red looking deflector shields or whatever they are. I don't know.
That was in the Bethesda or Washington area, if I'm not mistaken. And that this is off the top of my head, but I think it was a Lockheed XB-37 or 47. It's one of the better known drones. It's a hell of a drone. And actually, from the side, it could look like a flying saucer. From above or below, it looks more like a stealth fighter or a stealth bomber, except a little smaller. It's really impressive aircraft. It's got very good capabilities. The thing is, with a UFO, what makes a UFO what makes a flying saucer is, on one part of it's the shape, I suppose. But the real thing that makes it what it so unusual is what it can do. So we're talking instant acceleration, and we're talking, maneuvers that rapid, non-radius type maneuvers. So angular types of turns, which increasingly we're getting that capability, though. So more and more, it's going to be increasingly difficult for us to tell them apart, for sure.
Well, and of course, this is just the stuff that we see publicly acknowledged is probably 20-something years behind what's being developed in skunk works and behind the scenes. So I'd be very curious to see what the state of our real technology is at this point. But in regards to the smaller drones, the surveillance drones, one of the phenomena that I've found really interesting over the last couple of years is that local police departments have started mobilizing these, in residential areas and in U.S. cities. Yeah. And I actually had a couple interesting experiences with this. When I was attending the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, for anybody who's familiar with that area, it's not the best area. It's, basically South Central LA, bordering Watts. And so it's pretty rough. And there's always a huge police presence there. There's always a ton of, police helicopters overhead. But I'd say it was about a year and a half ago now, I tend to work best outside, so I would sit on my porch a lot and would just, I kind of tend to pay attention to what's going on in the sky. And on two different occasions, I observed it looked like a miniature helicopter, and until it got close, you almost couldn't tell that it wasn't a helicopter because it needed to be next to something for you to get a sense of the scale. But at one point, I saw one of these things that came down close to, it was basically hovering about level with the power line or the telephone pole, so it was pretty low. And it looked right at me and shined a light at me. And I could tell that this thing was not a normal helicopter. I was like, well, what is this? And I pull out my cell phone and try to capture some video of it. And as soon as I pull that phone out, it just took right off. Now, not very fast, but still very interesting. And so I did some research on this and found out that I believe it is something called the Vanguard Shadowhawk. And I have a little bit of information about this from a recent Business Insider article. And it says, the Vanguard Shadowhawk is seeing use all over the country. Right now, the Shadowhawk is one of the most powerful available drones for civilian police use. The helicopter drone comes with a Sony camera with 20x optical zoom. It's got a built-in GPS system with incredible accuracy, and it's already so powerful that the military versions come with space for a grenade launcher. It weighs 50 pounds and can carry 22 pounds. Has a max speed of 55 miles an hour and cruising speed of 35. And it says that Montgomery County, Texas has already bought one of these. Laredo, Texas has just acquired 2 of them. And it's being used for commercial purposes as well. But, it really is astonishing that this stuff is being rolled out on American streets, being used to monitor American citizens. And even if, Granted, I suppose you could make a somewhat reasonable argument in a really high crime area like where I was. Maybe something like that is reasonable, but I think it really pushes us far past the creepy line. What do you think about this phenomenon? Is this dangerous?
Yeah. Oh, I did not know that story that you just told. It's really fascinating. Like it or not, we're in an era now where the capability for agencies to spy on us is just so profound and so powerful. It is a double-edged sword. I live in a city. I'm in Rochester, New York, and we have crime here. And I don't like having crime in my neighborhood when it happens. So certainly, everyone, I think, in their neighborhood would like to see adequate police protection, over people and property. So there's that one aspect where you want your police to be well prepared. Hey, I grew up in a family of New York City police officers. My dad was a cop, a very active cop for many years. I know what it's like from that side. But, of course, you're absolutely right. The creepy line, that's a great phrase. We've gone over it. This is something that's happened without a real national discussion. Ever since 9/11, everything has just been shoved down our throat without any real public discourse. Now, I'm quite a bit older than you, and I came to age really during the 1970s. I graduated high school in 1980, and during that time, while you and your youth were living with the growing homeland security, national security state, I was dealing with really the last great gasp of American liberalism. This was the Jimmy Carter presidency. This was a time in which Congress did have hearings on the U.S. intelligence community. This was post-Watergate. And the mood of the country when I was growing up was very much one of challenging government authority on an array of areas. Now, that all started to change with the 1980s and the Reagan years. For yourself, Jonathan, you're younger than I am. We'll just say that. And so you grew up in an era, essentially, in which this kind of lurching toward totalitarianism has just gone without any checks, without any questioning. In the 70s, again, when I was growing up, this type of thing, I mean, people would have really started having riots if this type of activity had been discussed and openly acknowledged. Like, oh yeah, we're just going to spy on all of your letters to you. We're going to open up all of your mail and read everything. People would be like, what is this? And today, what's happened? We've had 11 years now of the 9/11 nightmare shoved down our collective throats, and frankly, people have just been beaten down. They've had, been living in code yellow and code orange now for so long that they've been I think, unfortunately, the American public's just been beaten down, and there's still some fight left in people, but I also feel that there's a lot of resignation that's around there, and that I hate to see that. I know you don't feel that way, and I don't feel that way. I try to remind people that we have a nation that is supposed to be founded on certain principles and the right to dissent and so forth, and we have to fight for that right. The Beastie Boys said it best: you have to fight for the right to party. Well, you do, and you have to fight for the right to free speech.
Absolutely. This is something that I think we need to fight for and stand up for. And one of the things that really stands out to me about this, this tactic of creeping incrementalism that's been slowly eroding our rights, and we're told every step of the way, this is necessary to keep you safe. We've come so far in 11 years in terms of what we're subjected to and our loss of privacy. But at the same time, it doesn't seem, I don't think, to any reasonable person like we're any safer now than we were 11 years ago. I mean, in fact, if you believe the government propaganda and the mainstream news, we're even more danger than we were before.
Yeah, and then think about what actually happened. You know, I remember 9/11. You remember. Everyone around remembers it. And not to minimize it, I mean, hell, my father worked at the World Trade Center. He had that day off. He shared his job with a very nice man that I knew who was killed that day.
Oh, wow.
Not to dismiss any of this, but, yeah, my point is that 9/11, as bad as it was, okay, really involved what exactly? It involved the destruction of the World Trade Center. Okay, that's a big deal, admittedly. And a somewhat relatively ineffective attack on the Pentagon and one other plane crash. That was 9/11. Now, as a result of that, we've instituted really a kind of proto-fascist state. And what have they done in the subsequent years? They said that they had a terrorist cell in Buffalo, New York, not far from where I'm at, which turned out to be complete bullshit. Sorry, but that's the word I'm going to say here. You can bleep it out later if you want.
I think our audience can handle it.
And then they found a shoe bomber. Can you believe this? Oh, and let's not forget the infamous underwear bomber. Okay? Now, these are the attacks on American national security. And I know they've said they've stopped many other attacks, supposedly. But you know what? It wears thin. It wears thin. What they've done, actually, is create a massive government apparatus of untold billions, I think at this point trillions of dollars of our money that have gone into protecting against this, really? Sorry, but we have other things that we could be spending our money on, things that could be like infrastructure building, the things that actually can make this a stronger country. And instead we've sunk it into wars against people that had nothing to do with our problem and have essentially bankrupted us, and on a domestic surveillance apparatus that equally is not productive in terms of economic growth. It just turns our country into a prison state. It's my opinion.
Well, a little bit of a heavy topic, but I think that these are important conversations for us to have. And so I guess as we continue this line of dialogue, I do want to make sure to try to end on a little bit more uplifting note, but there are two other things I want to...
I'm a happy guy, honestly.
You are. You do. For somebody who covers such heavy material, you always maintain a very cheery disposition, so that's always appreciated.
I do. I try, yes.
Well, so there's the other phenomenon in the field of national security that I want to broach is this whole executive order, this recent string of executive orders that's been coming out of the White House. Most notably we had the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which has been discussed pretty thoroughly at this point, though certainly not in the mainstream media. But even more recently, and this was last week, President Obama signed an executive order effectively authorizing the seizing of control of all national communications in a crisis. And these seem like somewhat interesting outliers that we probably need to pay attention to. Would you be able to discuss either of these?
Yes. The recent story you discussed, that's a brand new story, and I've done little more than read the headlines and maybe a couple of paragraphs. I mean, it's distressing to me as well. But what we've seen is essentially what would be the third term of George W. Bush. We've just been living in it. It's just called the presidency of Barack Obama. Obama was elected with this idea tossed, out there that he was going to be somehow different than Bush. I mean, after all, change you can believe in, right? Well, there hasn't really been any of that, truthfully, in terms of at least the grand national security strategy and as well as domestic strategy in terms of surveillance and so forth. All of that has continued very happily and very enthusiastically continued the measures that were initiated under the Bush years. So the NDAA, which has gotten a lot of press, is really simply a continuation of other things that happened under Obama. And under Bush before him. So, I don't want to lose my train of thought here. So, yes, there has been... Oh, for example, if you wanted to protest at the right to public protest, which has always been very, very central to American history, you cannot legally do that now in the if there are federal officials there. Like, so if the president gives a speech, you can only gather with certain types of permission, and if you engage in a kind of disruptive protest, you could be arrested. And that goes also for anyone running for president. It's like, if you were to try to do that at a Mitt Romney rally, you would be, in theory, you'd be breaking the law, and they could arrest you for that now. So there are all of these measures being taken. It's a kind of creeping fascism. 10 years ago, under the first few years of Bush, my children were much younger then, and I was out with them at a park. I was just watching them play, and there are all these other kids out there, and all the kids are having a good time. And I was observing the kids, and the question arose in my mind, these children, of course, could they possibly have any idea of the kind of world that they are right now living in, the fact that we're developing a new kind of fascism? And of course they were not aware of that. How could they? They were children. I looked over at their parents, reading newspapers, playing on their phones, and I thought, how many of these parents are even aware of what's happening around them? And then the insight occurred to me. Could you have a fascist state and have little to no one even be aware of it? Could you have, I call it, invisible fascism? And the answer is, of course it's possible. We get hung up on ideas of fascism. We think of Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and like the 1930s and jackboot guys marching in lockstep. Well, that's the kind of in-your-face fascism. But fascism doesn't have to be like that. Not at all. It can be quiet. It can look like your TV programming. It can be maybe kind of fun as long as you don't rock the boat. As long as you're controlled in a very thorough way, well, that is fascism. And the fact that you may not be aware of it doesn't make a bit of difference. So that's what I call invisible fascism. And that, I believe, is what we have been moving toward by greater and greater degrees overtly since 9/11. We've been moving in that direction, and it has not relented in the 3 years of Obama. It hasn't relented, 3.5 years. And whether it's Barack Obama or Mitt Romney, does anyone really think that initiative is going to change at the federal level? No, it won't. The only way it's going to change is if people force it to change. Otherwise, it won't happen.
We've seen. I think that a lot of people are really fed up with not just the fascist elements of the system, but or not just the privacy issues of the system, but all aspects of this fascist corporatist system that we have right now. We've seen the Occupy protest. We've seen mass protests just this week in Mexico and Japan, China last month in Russia. Iceland basically, kicked their politicians out and told the banks to go screw themselves. We had the Arab Spring, although I guess the outcome of that remains to be seen. But is this our best chance to stop this global police state in its tracks, or is this feasible? Is it realistic? Naive? Can we do it?
Yes, I think it can be done. The thing that's changing is we are everything's in flux right now. The power at the top is evolving, but so are the people at the bottom. We are constantly developing new ways of communicating with each other and of sharing information with each other. There are developments like WikiLeaks. I believe I mentioned that in our prior segment. Something like WikiLeaks didn't exist 10 years ago because it couldn't. We didn't have the capability for something like that. And keep in mind that the Arab Spring, which, yes, has turned out to be very much a disappointment, something that I think a lot of people did predict would happen, but it's still a disappointment. Nonetheless, the Arab Spring was sparked by WikiLeaks. A lot of times people forget this. It was the U.S. State Department cables that WikiLeaks released that some of those described, real depravity in the government of Tunisia. Just deeply, deeply corrupt actions there, which everyone kind of knew but hadn't been out in their face. And it was that release that actually was the key spark to the riots in Tunisia, and that was the beginning of the Arab Spring. And I think that there's a lot more where that came from. WikiLeaks or copycat organizations like that, they're not done. And I think that, whether it's people complain that it's all illegal, that they act the way they do, and frankly, I don't care. I support them. We need that.
Absolutely.
The world needs these releases, unauthorized, doesn't matter, of this information, because we really have gotten to a point where we have a right to know. No one really knows, but there are estimates that as much as 50% of all U.S. government documents that exist are classified in one form or another. That was indicated in a very fine book by a writer named Trevor Paglen called Blank Spots on the Map. And I don't know if the number is 50%, but it's got to be very, very high. We're at a point where everything's becoming classified. And in that sense, if you're a historian trying to put together the history of your government, then literally one could say that half of your government's history is secret. What kind of nonsense is that? So we need a corrective. And fortunately, we've got a global technological infrastructure where we are able to access and disseminate information in a way that just was never possible a generation ago or 2 generations ago. So I hold out hope for that. I think that it's the public snoops like Julian Assange and the rest of the WikiLeaks group, the people in Anonymous, and all the people like that are actually doing a tremendous service to humankind in correcting a gross imbalance that has been going to the side of secrecy and power. We can't let that happen. We really need to fight for openness, even at risk. I don't want to get anyone in trouble here, but the fact is that if we don't act, if we don't stand up, we'll be finding ourselves. We're going to wake up in a global police state in which even rights that we enjoy now will very likely not be there for us at that time.
And I think, absolutely, and I think it's not enough to let the Julian Assanges of the world and the whistleblowers blow this open for us. One of the sad things, I guess, about the recent series of leaks over the last year or two has been that the government, illegal acts will be exposed out in the open, and instead of doing anything to prosecute the illegal activity, the government goes after the whistleblowers themselves. And I think that we really owe it to ourselves, to our country, and to the whistleblowers who are brave enough to, take that risk, to stand up for them, to demand, fair treatment for people like Bradley Manning, for Julian Assange, and for many, many others.
Absolutely. Bradley Manning has been vilified. I mean, if anyone doesn't realize, he's probably the key individual in the U.S. military who allowed for the release of the Pentagon release, the Iraq documents and the State Department cables. He had access and he got them out, and he's been he's probably in isolation at this point. And the Obama administration, this is another thing where they've continued and even strengthened the initiatives of Bush, is in going after whistleblowers like Bradley Manning and others. Really just in a very heavy-handed manner. It's unsettling. It's frightening, but again, we have to have heart. A thing to keep in mind is, as bad as things look now, there are always dark days, but it's not going to be dark forever. We have to remember life is like this. There are good periods, there are bad periods, and time is long enough that there will be changes. I really believe this, and change can happen very, very suddenly, very quickly. We're in a world where, no one really uses pressure cookers anymore, but I remember them as a kid. Before there were microwaves, if you wanted something cooked quickly, you'd use a pressure cooker, and the way it worked is it would have a very heavy lid that would kind of lock on to the pot, and it would have like a little thing on the top of it that would bounce. It would not bounce. It would like move back and forth and slowly allow steam to exit so that the pot wouldn't blow up. But if you didn't do the pressure cooker right, you literally it could just go boom. It could explode. So we're like a pressure cooker in the sense that there's this tremendous pressure that is building up in our world. This tremendous disconnect between what we know is true and yet what officially is supposed to be true. And that disconnect is getting larger and larger. So that there's going to be a time when, when that is corrected, when the pressure is released. Or there's a better analogy, actually, is that of the emperor's new clothes. One of my favorite stories of all time. You've probably heard it. The very vain emperor wants to have a new outfit for this great parade that's coming up in a few weeks. And this one shifty con man convinces the emperor that he has the best, the finest fabric. Of course, there's no fabric there at all. It's invisible because it doesn't exist. But he convinces the emperor, oh, yeah, I kind of see that. And so he gets a lot of money and creates this fictitious garment that's nothing at all, puts it on the emperor. The emperor's naked, and he's walking down the street, and everyone's afraid to state the obvious, so they're all saying, oh, wow, what incredibly fine fabric. What an incredible job. Until this one little boy says, but he's naked. He's not wearing anything at all. We're in that world in so many ways, where all of these fictitious realities are being shoved down our throats. These fictitious things are being foisted upon us. And right now, people are more or less accepting them as true. Terrorists are out to get you. If you give them half a chance, they'll sneak into your bedroom. Things like this. You have to allow us to read all of your emails, and on and on and on. But it's going to happen that people are going to say, I'm not going to take it anymore. And it's going to happen very suddenly. I don't think there's going to be any warning. Something will happen. A mistake will happen. Someone's going to screw up. Something will leak out. I don't know what it's going to be, but I think it's an inevitability. And when it happens, who knows how bad it will get. I think there is absolutely the opportunity for a worldwide movement. And in fact, as you were just mentioning, there are demonstrations going on around the world all the time. They're not getting covered, but it's going to happen.
And they're getting bigger, and there seems to be something really major building here in the collective consciousness. And I for one am very excited to see where that takes us. But we are out of time, and so that's it for our second episode of the 3-part series with Richard Dolan. Make sure to join us again next week as we discuss the topics of spirituality and consciousness and their complex relationship to the UFO phenomenon. This is sure to be an interesting conversation and one of great interest to many of our listeners, so please stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Richard, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. It was a pleasure.